I had the great good fortune to work with a number of teachers in Cuba last week. And one of the things that happened to me in Cuba was I was taken to something called the Museo de la Campaña de la Alfabetización, which, if you want, is roughly translated as the Literacy Museum. Almost the only literacy museum in the world. Probably actually the only literacy museum in the world. And it's worth telling a little story about that because it says something profound about teaching, or at least it says something profound about the myth of teaching. So in 1961, say what you like about Fidel Castro, but he did this extraordinary thing. He went to the United Nations and he said, we're going to be the only country that within a few months has not a single illiterate person in the country. And then he went back to Cuba and he said, come on guys, you've got to help me. I've said that we're going to have no illiterate people in Cuba. Help me, help me, help me. And the result was extraordinary because full of revolutionary zeal. The Cuban Revolution had only happened a year and a half, 2 years before. Full of revolutionary zeal. The youth, especially of Cuba, poured into the countryside, all over the poorest areas of Cuba where there wasn't any electricity, no light or anything else like that. And they went rushing, hundreds of thousands of kids, mostly kids, 18, 19-year-olds, 13-year-olds, even as young as 9, one of them. And they went into the countryside to help the illiterate people learn how to read and write. And what they would do is they would stay in the house of a farm worker, a campesino, and they'd teach him and his wife how to read and write, and then they'd move on. That was the idea. And they went, and they all went out, and they had these special lamps called El Farol, and the lamps were to give light. Very powerful mythology, very powerful propaganda. And they're not just to give light, real light, because there was no electricity, but also to give light, the light of literacy and so on. And essentially what happened, give or take the odd truth at the margins, is that they eradicated illiteracy in Cuba in a year. An extraordinary achievement. Now, this isn't a defense of the Cuban Revolution or an attack on it, that's up to you, I don't care. But this literacy issue was just amazing. And in 1 year, they made Cuba a totally literate island. The result of that is, to this very day, Cubans travel around the world teaching literacy. One of the people I talked to had just come back from Australia, where he had been working teaching literacy with an Aboriginal community in the middle of nowhere in Australia. And they go to lots of other countries in the world, and many countries base their literacy programs on Cuba. Anyway, what happened in this particular case? And when it was all over, the hundreds of thousands of these youths filled Revolutionary Square, and they had a huge celebration to celebrate the end of literacy, and they all had these giant pencils they carried instead of guns, which you would normally expect. I mean, they're so good at symbolism and propaganda, these guys. And they said, and they all shouted, Fidel, Fidel, they said, tell us what more we have to do. And he just, his voice boomed over Revolution Square. He just said, study, study, study. It wasn't all sweetness and light, because something I didn't know before I went to this museum was that there were counter-revolutionaries on the island, and who wanted to stop the Cuban Revolution, and so they went and killed some of these volunteers, shot them. The first one was a guy called Conrado Benitez, an 18-year-old. And there's one celebrated story, and this is of a man called Manuel Alconce Domenech, and he was in the house of a campesino, a peasant called Pedro Lantigua. And the counter-revolutionaries burst in, the bandidos, the bandits, they burst in and they shot Pedro Lantigua, the farmer, who was being taught to read and write. And then they said to his wife, who's this? Pointing to the young man who went into the countryside to teach literacy, this Manuel Alconce. And the woman said, hoping to save Manuel's life, she said, oh, he's my son. But Manuel, filled with the pride of what he was doing, and even though he knew it was probably going to cause him his life, which it did, he said, no, yo soy el maestro. I am the teacher, he said, with pride. So that now, Cuban kids, when they enter teacher training college, they all have t-shirts, and on the back it's written, yo soy el maestro, I'm the teacher. And I find that an incredibly powerful story, and for many Cubans it gives them a sense of el orgullo de ser maestro. The pride of being a teacher is incredibly strong. and I just think there's a little lesson there for everybody.